As David rightly mentioned, this famous dictum or statement by well-known scholar of political science or philosopher or the scholar of international relations, Francis Fukuyama, was somehow this end of history idea somehow has become kind of the major sentiment describing the reality that has been established since the end of the Cold War, since the end of this superpower competition or ideological competition, which was the part of the conflict between United States and its allies on the one hand, and the Soviet Union and its satellite countries on the other. So in my presentation, actually, I will somehow to look from critical perspective to this idea, whether this idea was wrong or right, whether this idea was kind of had any other implications as well, and whether this idea is still relevant for understanding the situation that exists in current international system. Just one kind of short notice that I will be mostly talking from the perspective of from the perspective of the field of international relations. So that will be kind of the major kind of the discipline on which I will base my today's talk. So this is shortly the content of today's discussion. First of all, I will try somehow to introduce to you, and probably you all know about these two different ideas or two different theories, how the world actually works, because you know that international relations is quite rich when it comes to the intellectual traditions which try to explain how the international system works or how it has worked in the past and how it supposedly will work in the future. Then I will somehow look at what was kind of the basic idea of this end of history paradigm, and besides this intellectual roots of this idea, what was the empirical kind of the record of the idea, or what was the empirical basis of the idea itself. And then I will somehow look at from more critical perspective whether this idea is still relevant and whether this idea can be a guiding kind of the principle for understanding current international relations. And the final part would be something like more practical one, somehow trying to give you my own views regarding what should be and what will be the right kind of the policies in order to somehow to deal with the current situation in the world politics. So now let me turn to kind of to the ideas of to the theories. We all know that the world is quite complex enterprise, and especially when it comes to the world of states. So that's kind of the basic agreement in the discipline of IR that if you want to understand the world, we need at least some simplification of it, or we need ideas which will help us to grasp the major forces which actually affect how the world system or international system or the state system is working. In other terms, we can call these ideas theories of intellectual traditions or schools of thought. And in the field of political science and international relations, and not only, I would say, in the social sciences generally, there are two types, broadly, there are two types of ideas, two types of theories or worldviews. One, the first is the kind of the very traditional perspective, which we can call like the positivist one, or perspective which is based on the belief that the objective social science is possible and the theories are kind of the objective tools in order to get to understand the world out there. So from a traditional perspective, these theories, mostly these ideas and theories, help us to describe and explain, and to some extent, the theories also prescribe the way of action when it comes to understanding the world, which exists out there, independent of our views and the theories and knowledge about and knowledge which we have about it. There is also the critical perspective, which of course brings a lot of different schools of thought and different theories under its name. But the major kind of the idea of these critical perspectives, the theories which are more critical of this traditional view, is that there is no independent kind of the reality, which is independent of the meanings that we as a social actors attach to that reality. So kind of our ideas and our theories about the world are actually the major forces which somehow help us to construct, to socially construct the world out there. So to use kind of the famous title of one of the leading scholar in IR, the reality is always to some extent socially constructed, and the ideas and the theories that we have about it are not independent of the reality is not independent of the ideas and the theories that we have about them. So definitely we need some theories, and the theories, besides the fact that these theories help us to simplify the reality, which is kind of the only option to understand that reality. Also, the theories provide some kind of the mental pictures of how the world works or how it should work. So that's kind of the positivist and normative element in which is ingrained in any theory. So in the field of international relations, when it comes to the major question, how the kind of the world of nations or world of nation states operates, what are the major driving forces when it comes to the international relations? Usually we have two contested or two ideas which are in quite total opposition to each other. So now I will try somehow to give you a brief kind of the overview of the major two major schools of thought about international relations. The first school of thought, which is mostly known as this realism, political realism, or the school of the power politics, is one of the longest and one of the kind of the school of thought which has the longest tradition in the field of international relations, and it has quite specific understanding of how the international politics works. And here are some of the major kind of the principles of this school of thought provides when trying to understand the system of international politics. So what are the major assumptions? The first major assumption of this power politics understanding of the world is that major players in international system are territorial states or modern nation states, which define the basic parameters of the international politics, but not all states are created equal. So while formally all states can be equal when it comes to their kind of the status from the perspective of international law, in reality, the power politics perspective argues only great powers, all the states with bigger power capabilities are the most important players in the international system. So usually this power politics approach, when it talks about international politics, it mostly focuses on the role of the great powers which define the context and the processes inside the international system. When it comes to the nature of the system itself, so what type of the system is created between the states, or what's the context of international system, the power politics approach or this political realism approach argues that in reality, the international system, the organizing principle of international system is this Hobbesian state of nature. This is the condition when the states do not recognize any central authority standing above them. So in more kind of the simple words, this is the situation when you have the politics without government. And that's kind of this Hobbesian war of all against all dictum, which actually presupposes the situation in which there is no central authority who can provide the security for the actors inside the system. So the political realist believes that the system of states is different from the system which states have inside their borders. And if the state itself from inside is more hierarchical system based on the fact that there is the government which is responsible for providing security to its citizens. In international system, we don't have the central government who can somehow who can provide security assurances to its members and to the players of the system. And in such a situation or in such a scenario, as far as there is no central authority who can provide the security guarantees to its members, the most important concern or the most important policy issues that states in anarchical international system face is the issue of how to survive and how to ensure achievement of national security goals in a very traditional way. Based on that context and based on that understanding, realism also believes that the power and security is the DNA of international politics. So, in order to survive, in order to achieve your national interests, you need to have power. So that's why the focus on the great powers, because they are the powers which have the biggest capacity of influencing the nature of international system and the context of international system. So pursuit for power and security is the constant kind of the characteristic of the international politics. Also very important emphasis when it comes to the question how without existence of the government, because we know that the government's kind of the classic function of the government has been provision of the security to its citizens. And that's actually the whole idea of this Hobbesian philosophy, that when the citizens managed, when the people managed to leave the kind of the state of nature, they entered into political system which somehow took responsibility for providing for their safety and security. But if the system of international politics has no such authority as the central government, then the question arises, what is the most efficient way to provide the security? How can states provide security for themselves? And on that question, the major answer, or the kind of the leading answer that the political realists, the power politics theory kind of the proponents have, is that preserving the balance of power is the most efficient way for achieving international regional stability. So preserving the balance of power is that this assumption means that nothing than power can stop potential aggressors. So as far as there is no government who can enforce any norms or any rules, only power can deter or stop the aggression. And finally, I would say that one of the most important assumptions of the political realist school is that this DNA of international politics, this pursuit for power, the deficit of the security, which is kind of the constant of international politics, is cannot be changed. And any desire or any attempt to change this logic of international politics is doomed to failure. So in other words, and that's why they are called realists, in other words, we should accept the world as it is. So that's kind of the major idea of the theory, that the world out there functions according to these principles of power politics. So we should understand these principles, but we should not try to change it, because we won't succeed. But of course, that's not only kind of the idea about how international politics works. And we have another idea, which is somehow which provides different understanding of the international relations. And this idea is more optimistic, I would say. And it differs from pessimistic kind of the emphasis that the power politics approaches have. So what are the major assumptions of this more kind of the critical or kind of the liberal understanding of international relations? The first major assumption is that in contrast to political realism, the state is no more only actor in international politics. And we have this multiplicity of players, whether sub-state, non-state, transnational or multinational actors, who all challenge the power and the autonomy and dominant position that the state once had. So the state is not the only actor and the major actor in international system. The second assumption then that these theories also have is that while political realism has very pessimistic understanding of international politics, these liberal or more critical theories believe that international politics is more about peace and cooperation and more about achieving goals which are beneficial for the parties involved, rather than it's about kind of the international conflict or war. So liberals or these representatives of this alternative worldview have much more optimistic kind of the understanding of the nature of international politics. In contrast to realists who argue that the major concern of the states is physical security or survival or the national security in a very traditional sense, the liberal school of thought argues that this concern with physical survival or with so-called state-based, we can use this term, which is the term describing whether the number of states is diminishing in the system compared to the previous centuries. Liberals argue that because of the increasing importance of norms of territorial integrity and respect for the sovereignty of the states, and overall, because of the increasing importance of international law and norms-based international order, states do not, this kind of the concerns for survival are not the most important concerns that states today have, because this change in the nature of the international politics has somehow eliminated this kind of the very traditional type of the threats that states had in previous centuries. As a result of that, the military power is not as important as it used to be. And usually here are two kind of the different arguments why military power has, or maybe three different arguments why military power has lost its kind of the significance that it once had. The first is that because of the military revolution and because of the technological progress in the field, in the sphere of military technology, the conquest becomes much kind of the harder and becomes much more expensive. That's one argument. Another argument is that today states can gain much more in economic sense by trading with each other rather than by having war and conflict with each other. So the economic value of conquering the territories has been somehow diminished. And also there is another factor, is the factor of nationalism. We know that the nationalism is kind of the modern phenomena, and we know that there is well-known psychological component when the nation sees that someone is threatening the national integrity of its state. Usually the nation unites against this threat, and it makes, of course, much more difficult for the potential aggressor to occupy and then to control this occupied territory. So nationalism, this hard feeling of national sentiments, also somehow makes conquest and occupation much more difficult in today's world than it was, for example, in the medieval period, before the times when the nation was kind of the major focus of the population's loyalty. And also, in regards to the question, what are the major principles which can ensure stability and security in the system, in contrast to the political realism, which believes that the balance of power is the most tried and most trusted way of providing stability within the system. Liberal school and the more critical perspectives argue that the balance of power is the system which actually leads to war and instability. And in order to have much more stable order inside the international system, we need the principles of collective security, and we need the principles of not security dilemma, but of the security community as the basis of more stable and more peaceful relationship between the states and the nations. And finally, in contrast to the more pessimistic view of international politics, which is proposed by power politics proponents, this worldview argues that the story of international politics is the story of gradual human progress. And they just argue that look at, for example, at the number of the wars and compare current situation with the situation which was like 4 or 5 centuries, or even at the beginning or in the first half of the 20th century. Definitely the number of wars between the states has decreased to much extent. Of course, wars happen, but still the number of the wars is much less today than it was like in previous centuries. So overall, this liberal understanding of international politics provides much more optimistic view of how international system actually works. So after somehow discussing these two broad ideas, now I would like to look at the situation after the end of the Cold War and what were the major foundations of the so-called post-Cold War era optimism, or what was the foundation for this idea of that history actually has ended. Especially since the end of the Cold War and especially in the 90s, a lot of empirical facts somehow provided empirical support for this idea that international relations and this liberal world order was moving in right direction around the globe. And here are some of the kind of the major aspects of that belief. The first aspect, and actually this was kind of the major focus of Fukuyama's end of history argument, after the end of the Cold War and after this end of this ideological confrontation or competition between two big ideas. On the one hand, the idea of liberal democracy and the market economy, and on the other hand, the idea of kind of centralized authoritarian systems based on centrally planned economies. In this competition, liberal democracy has won and market capitalism has won. Liberal democracy as a political idea and market capitalism as an economic idea proved to be superior to its alternative. So that's why Fukuyama argued that this history ended in a sense that this ideological competition between liberalism, liberal democracy and communist ideology or centrally planned economic ideology has demonstrated that liberal democracy is the only viable idea for the current world. And in reality, liberal democracy, especially in the 90s, was somehow the idea which really had kind of the hegemonic position among the alternative ideas. There was no idea which can compete on equal basis with this idea of liberal democracy. And what we see in the 90s is that this gradual and in some cases very kind of the fast wave of democratization around the world in the former Soviet, within the former Soviet Union, in the satellite countries of the former Soviet Union, the liberalism was the only kind of the game in town. Even the authoritarian leaders somehow pretended to be Democrats. You know, they were drafting democratic constitutions. They were talking like Democrats, even if their behavior was in opposition to real liberal and democratic values. The idea of democracy was kind of the unchallenged, and everyone agreed that the liberal democracy was kind of the only legitimate idea for organizing societies and states. At the same time, what we see is also the trend of increasing economic, cultural, and all other type of relationship between states and societies. If during the Cold War, actually this interdependence was mostly regional, had mostly regional context, because these two blocks, like on the one hand, the Western Bloc and the Soviet Bloc, were just closed and had minimal contact with each other. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we see the increase in the interdependence of among states. And the basic idea, which actually somehow supported the whole concept of the liberal world order, was that interdependence, and especially interdependence in trade, will to some extent lead to the peace and cooperation among states. So from that, this well-known idea that states will become such an interdependent that they will understand that keeping this interdependence alive is much more rational for them, rather than somehow trying to have the conflicts or the wars with each other. Besides increasing interdependence among the states, what we also see, especially in that time, and I would say that deepening of integration within the EU was really good proof of that, is that upward mobility or upward move of the sovereignty from national to supranational levels. We know that sovereignty, the political sovereignty, is mostly the characteristic of the nation states, of the modern states. But because of the international integration and because of the increasing influence of different sub-state or transnational or supranational forces, a lot of scholars have started to talk about diminished power of the state, about the fact that the state is no more in control of the politics within it and outside it. Also, this interdependence the cultural, economic, or in the field of the trade, has led to the diminished role of the military power. Scholars have started to argue that the world has become much more complex, and the number of topics which cannot be resolved, or number of the problems which cannot be resolved by using just brutal or the hard military power, has increased, and the military power is not the dominant instrument that states somehow have in their arsenal today. And the most important, of course, related to all these factors, was somehow the belief that the norms, the principles of international law, of respect for territorial integrity, respect for human rights, respect for this the international basic principles of international law, became the major foundation of the current international system. And this idea of the balance of power, which was regarded as more prone to the conflict and instability, was substituted by the norms of the security community or the collective security. So that was the situation that we got, especially in the first decades of the end of the Cold War. And basically what we see is that Fukuyama's well-known dictum that history has ended was somehow based on these quite optimistic empirical observations of that time. But in reality, the situation has proved not to be such a simple one, because the life outside the so-called liberal order proved to be quite similar to the history from which we are trying to escape, actually. And in last decades, we see that the progress in that direction has been, in some parts of the world, has been either stopped or has been has been reached to some extent, maybe its limits as well. One major trend which we observe today in the world is this authoritarian backlash, or we can call it democratic recession. Different scholars use different terms, and here I brought this statement by Larry Diamond, who is one of the leading scholars of democracy of the current times. And he argues that in every region of the world, autocrats are seizing the initiative. Democrats are on the defensive. We are now witnessing a global retreat from freedom. So authoritarian backlash is kind of the problem which the world really faces today. But besides this problem that democracy or liberal democracy has kind of the alternatives in a sense of different, in a sense of authoritarian politicians and political systems, what we also see is that these hopes which were linked to the peaceful nature of the interdependent international system also has proved to be quite problematic, because even the Russian-Ukrainian war to some extent demonstrates that while Russia was quite well integrated into world economy and it had really strong economic relations with the Western Europe, still this interdependent nature of these relations did not dissuade Russia to start this aggression against the sovereign country. So the whole idea that the interdependence will lead to their eternal peace somehow proved to be problematic. Another failure from this perspective of kind of the different idea or the theory was this failure to some extent of the modernization theory, which argued that market economy at some point will definitely lead to political liberalization. And we know that it's well-known modernization theory, which argues that economic modernization, market economy, and increase in the economic output of the society at some point will definitely lead to the political openness and the liberalization of the closed political systems. But what we now see, and I would say that China is kind of a really good example of that, in some parts of the world, autocracies successfully practice market capitalism without political openings and without political liberalization. Also, the problem outside the liberal order is problems are related to the context of the state itself. On the one hand, we have the state decay as a huge political problem for current international politics. And in state decay, I mostly mean the problem when the state formally exists, but actually it cannot provide its basic functions. And in other terms, we can call it the state failure or the weak state phenomenon, which is somehow a huge problem for current international security and international and global order, because such states are usually good targets of different non-state actors, especially terrorist groups who would like to use this uncontrolled situation within the state. To say it in other words, the major problem in case of the failed state is that the state has not monopoly on the legitimate use of the force. And that's definitely one of the extreme of the problems related to the modern state in the current international system. But on the other extreme, we have the state phenomenon of the state capture, when state is so much centralized and so much authoritarian that it itself becomes the problem for its citizens and for international stability. So we are seeing these two extremes in different parts of the world. On the one hand, we have this problem of big state phenomenon, when state is so weak that it cannot perform its major function, or it cannot monopolize the use of the violence within its territory. And on the other hand, we see the state capture by different groups, which somehow bring state to their own interests, and they use the state as an instrument against the population of the countries. In that sense, the state itself becomes the major threat for the society. And also what we see outside the liberal order is that if inside the liberal order, the hard power and military power has definitely lost its importance. Outside it, still the hard power is still the most important currency. So hard power is still very important for which somehow is the final arbiter when it comes to the relations between the state, and finally the norms and the principles which have been acclaimed, which have been seen as the kind of the major restrictions on state actions. We see that outside the liberal order, still the norms of territorial integrity and respect for sovereignty are quite hard to defend. So, what are the dangers of actually of this end of history paradigm, to say it in another word? Actually, what the current situation in the world shows and demonstrates is that even if we agree that the history has ended, and even if we agree with Fukuyama that this his dictum is kind of correct, definitely it did end only in some part of the world, in a very small part of the world. We can call this part of the world liberal world, or the world of the Western and transatlantic nations. But besides this security community, which was created within the West and transatlantic community, we still see the shadow of the security dilemma, and the states are still living under the shadow of the power politics and very traditional threats to their national security. Also, there was this kind of the dictum of end of history created the belief that the progress was inevitable, and gradually the progress at some point, this liberal world order and the progress of humanity will become more global and more total in its nature. But actually, this progress is not inevitable. The history shows that progress is inevitable, and the progress can be achieved only by hard work and determination by particular players involved in the processes. And here is really interesting point by Robert Kagan, who argues that the major problem is that we have lived inside the bubble of the liberal world order so long that we have forgotten what the world as it is really looks like. So the danger of this idea of end of history was somehow to ingrain the belief that the world everywhere works according to the principles which apply to the world inside the liberal world order itself. And I believe that this recent Russian aggression against Ukraine, which actually started in Georgia in 2008, one of the first Russian military adventures since the end of the Cold War, outside adventures, have actually started with Georgia in 2008. Then we had Ukraine in 2014, and now this ongoing aggression in violation of any norms of international law or humanitarian international law are huge signals, or very vivid signals, that that the history is still running as it used to be outside the liberal order. And definitely the major question that we should ask is that whether the liberal order itself or the security community itself can be safe if outside it jungle is growing back. And now this is kind of the final part of my talk, that I will somehow try to provide some recommendations or ideas about what should be done, or what's the road ahead, what's the road that lies ahead. I believe that it will be a difficult journey, and we need something like new containment strategy. And I have here this well-known American diplomat and well-known scholar George Kennan's idea of how to contain with long-term, patient but firm and vigilant strategy, how to contain Russia's expansive tendencies. And here, of course, we can talk not only about Russia, but also we can talk about any other authoritarian regimes, including China, for example. And what we really need in order to keep the liberal order alive, and what we really need to make the liberal order safe, is that, first of all, I believe that the order needs leader, and the United States should keep this role of the state which is able and which has the desire to somehow keep the system which actually it created after the end of the so-called Second World War. What's the most important is also that inside the liberal order, the renewed commitment to core democratic values should be demonstrated, because what we are seeing today is that the problems when it comes to the democratic recession are characteristics of not only states outside the order, but even inside the order are quite big problems in particular states of West. Also, very important strategy would be to somehow empower pro-democracy actors outside the liberal order, whether it's civil society, media, political actors, and any actor who is kind of the pro-democracy actors in different countries. The very important point is that we need to demonstrate that democracies are efficient. Democracies must deliver. So democracy is also, it's not only about participation, it's also about efficiency. Democratic states need to be efficient in delivering basic public goods in order that citizens have trust in them, and the citizens believe that the democracy is rational and legitimate idea for organizing their societies. And also, I think that what's most important, and especially this is really important in the context of increased geopolitical competition, whether with Russia or whether future competition between West and China, that there should be no compromises over fundamental principles in light of the increased geopolitical competition, because usually when there is the big stress on from the perspective of increased geopolitical competition, this has quite negative influence on the freedoms and on the democracy. So there should be agreement that there will be no compromises over fundamental principles, even if they come into conflict with so-called pragmatic or the strategic interests.